Elizabeth, hi.
Hi, welcome. Nice to see you.
Good to see you.
Beautiful day.
Not too bad.
All right.
I met Elizabeth at American University in Washington, D.C., where she is an assistant professor of critical race, gender, and culture studies.
So I'm a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation. We're a tribal nation headquartered in Ada, Oklahoma, right? Or Chickasaw Territory, really. And I am a very proud citizen of my tribal nation. I have always known that I'm Chickasaw and grew up, although not within our traditional lands or within our tribal boundaries, grown up with a strong sense of self and cultural participation. My father represents tribes as an attorney, and so I was raised with that influence heavy on my own life. And for a long time, I planned to follow in his footsteps to become an attorney, right, that represented tribes and was able to make a positive impact through that type of advocacy. But actually, when I entered university, I started thinking about my own world differently, right? Through the introduction of new histories, new texts, new theories for understanding the world around me. And so I actually shifted and decided that I wanted to be an educator and help others understand, right, how we are, where we are. And so for that reason, now I actually specialize in Indigenous legal history, focusing on American Indian law and policy.
Elizabeth is an internationally respected voice on Native American issues. Her research focuses on gendered violence in Indigenous communities.
Speaking of violence against women and girls, that's something you're working on right now, a book on that. What got you interested in it? And I imagine anytime you approach a book like that, you have kind of set views. This is what I'm going to find. Are you finding those? Are there some surprises along the way? Talk to us about that journey.
So the book I'm working on right now is titled Reproducing Resistance, Gendered Violence and Indigenous Nationhood. And it's really a study of the intersection between violence against Native women and reproductive justice issues, both in the US and Canadian contexts. This issue became really important to me to study because as a Native woman living in the world, I was hearing so many stories and testimonies of violence. I was also going through graduate school right at the moment when the movement for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls was really on the rise and getting some visibility for the first time, which is excellent. But these issues are not new. And so I really wanted to add a piece of scholarly research into the conversation to show how things like homicide, sexual abuse, domestic violence are also connected to areas of reproductive justice or injustice rather. So I'm seeking to align things like forced or coerced sterilization, right, with the same types of dehumanization and violence that we also see in some of these other acts. So that's really the focus of the book.
There was a documentary out just a couple of years ago called Broken Trust, which delved into Native American women being raped and how this form of violence really wasn't even a part of the national conversation. But one of the things that they really got into was the difficulties in prosecuting these cases because of the laws and how cumbersome they are with the federal government. It's not like you have state, and also it gets back to resources. They don't really have large police departments, prosecutors. Can you talk about that? Because I imagine you've come across that as you've studied this.
Absolutely. One of the main issues with violence against Native women comes back to jurisdictional authority, right? Who has the right and the ability to intervene when a Native woman calls in crisis, right, having been victimized. And this is a very difficult issue. There have been Supreme Court cases, such as Oliphant v. Suquamish, that look into and have changed the ability of tribes to exercise criminal jurisdiction over non-Native perpetrators of crimes committed on Indian lands. And what we see today really are legal loopholes that allow perpetrators to act with impunity. And for that reason, we also see very high rates of violence against Native women, particularly carried out on reservation lands. Again, this is not natural or inevitable, right? This is the direct cause of laws and policies and Supreme Court decisions that have taken away protections that Native women would otherwise have, and have taken away also the sense of justice, right, that tribes would be able to exercise and move forward if they could prosecute non-Native perpetrators of violence committed on Native lands. The vast majority of tribes are still unable to carry out that sovereign right.
I, Deborah Holland.
I, Deborah Holland.
Do solemnly swear.
In March 2021, United States Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland, made history becoming the first Native American to ever hold the position. Just a few months after taking office, she announced plans to investigate the federal government's past oversight of Native American boarding schools.
A Native American in a cabinet position, that's a huge step forward. Would you agree?
Huge step. It's so symbolic, right? To all the young Native people out there, right? That Native people can hold these types of positions. And it also sends a message to everyone, right? That Indian country has a voice in the federal government, that we're being heard on the highest levels, and particularly, you know, that person understands, right, the types of challenges our communities face, and has great experience and insight into, you know, the unique facets of tribal sovereignty and what can be done to really support Native communities today.
The boarding school issue seems to have come to some sort of reckoning in Canada, and I think that still here in the United States, it's a story that really hasn't resonated. I don't think a lot of people are familiar with it. Why is that, do you think?
That's absolutely right. So in Canada right now, there are more and more sites where these residential schools were located that are uncovering, in some cases, mass graves of Native children who died while in the custody and care of these institutions. In the US, we have not undergone that same process to find, right, our lost Native children. But we know in our own Indigenous communities through stories, right, of children who were lost, children who never came home, children who disappeared. And so also, although Canada is going through that process right now, there's still tremendous work to be done. And that work remains both in the US and in the Canadian context. The Truth and Reconciliation effort, for example, I mean, that's a very tall order, right? Because the fact is that Canada and the US, right, are still settler colonial societies. And I think there's a very long road ahead to addressing some of the intergenerational trauma created by boarding school systems, but also other policies as well. There is a really long history of assimilation efforts to bring Native communities into this, you know, mainstream Euro-American society and culture. Particularly, we can see that when looking at boarding school history and boarding school policies. So from the late 1800s all the way up through the mid 1900s, really, you know, there were institutions, some of them government run, some of them church run, that brought, you know, Native youth as young as 3, 4 years old, all the way up until 16, 17, 18, into these institutions with the goal of killing the Indian and saving the man. What that statement really reflects is a policy shift away from the United States engaging in military conflict with indigenous nations, right? And instead, partially due to the cost of military conflict, adopting this new idea, right? Instead of physically killing Native communities and Native populations, they would instead kill the Indian, right? Kill the culture, kill the identity, while maintaining, the physical body of that person. And so these attempts at assimilation, they sought to eradicate indigenous language, separate young Native children from their communities, from their families, from their identities, from their political participation in their tribal nations. Again, all with the idea of becoming American, right? And in this case, American being Euro-American.
Generally, Native Americans within the U.S. are grouped according to regions. While they all share similarities, there are also stark contrasts, each with its own unique history.
We've had a chance to talk about Ada. What a lot of people don't think about is that Washington, D.C. is home to indigenous communities. You're writing about that. Tell us about this project.
That's absolutely right. So I am working on a book right now called Indigenous DC, Native Peoples and the Nation's Capital. And we oftentimes don't associate Washington, D.C. with tribal communities, but the fact is that Native people have been here long before it was the capital of the United States, and we continue to be here making our influence in policy, art, protest, all facets of life. And so that's really what I'm investigating in this text.
And you have an app that's associated with it too. So if people were interested, describe how that can help them.
That's right. So the app is called Indigenous DC, a guide to Indigenous DC, and users can find that in their iOS or Apple App Store, as well as if they have Android products, they can find it there. It's free, it's publicly facing, and it's for folks who may have no prior experience with Indigenous topics. K through 12 students can use it as well, and it's really a fun way to learn about Indigenous influences here in Washington, D.C.
Many Native Americans see part of the problem as educating a non-Native audience. Often, they are unaware of the challenges Native Americans currently face.
As I mentioned to you, in 2014, I was at this conference in Winnipeg, and one of the things that the broadcasters told me, and these are Indigenous broadcasters, they said sharing Indigenous stories through broadcasting channels and digital media is very hard. There are no shortages of barriers or obstacles to overcome. And I know you're telling Indigenous stories, so would you agree with that?
You know, I would say that one of the most important issues facing Indigenous communities today is getting our stories out there to a non-Indigenous public, right? We have so many stereotypes about who we are as a people, and those range everything from being figures of the past and not being contemporary people to, racist stereotypes, things that have been perpetuated through media, film, advertising, right? And so for Indigenous people to tell our stories in the 21st century, we're coming up against those ideas that non-Indigenous communities have about who we are. And so much of that work of storytelling is a combination of addressing those stereotypes, those preconceived notions, and then filling in that blank with the truth about who we are as Indigenous communities and Indigenous peoples, and also sharing our unique perspectives and points of view, and our ways of even understanding and thinking about ourselves. But I absolutely agree, though, that storytelling and getting those Indigenous voices out there is absolutely essential.
One of the other things I came away with talking to the various people at this conference is equal parts trauma and resiliency. And I think both are important elements, perhaps resiliency even more than trauma, but talk to me about that.
It's no secret, right, that Indigenous populations have been through a lot in the US context, and really a lot even in other countries, right, abroad. But again, you know, we have this narrative that Native people aren't here anymore, but we are, right? And not only are we here, to your point about resiliency, we're thriving. You know, if you look at our communities, our tribal governments, our Native youth, there are so many systemic barriers and struggles, you know, towards success. But at the same time, our Indigenous communities are proud of our identities. We're proud of who we are. And particularly in this moment, right, this policy era of self-determination, we're seeing more and more tribal nations really embracing programs and elements that offer opportunities to young people, that are getting folks of all ages involved with learning Indigenous languages, that are supporting things like education initiatives. And so absolutely, right? I mean, a key feature and characteristic of our Indigenous communities is our resiliency, our strength, and our pride.
Well, hopefully we can help do that as well. Thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.